My name is Sil the DM, and today I'm bringing you a D&D recap for my campaign, The City, for the week of January 17th, titled The City of Justice. Picking up where we left off, our intrepid group of idiots were journeying north from the city of Kothsho to Stockton on a mission from Ohm, the halfling, uh, who currently sits at the seat of power within the council of the city, um, to parley with the god Jamal, who uses Stockton as the center of his power while staying on the material plane, um, to inquire as to why the clerics and paladins and other religious casters within the city and members of the council have come under this sort of lethargy and ennui and just this odd sense of dilution to their magic. There's been this overarching sense of distance, and none of the religious casters interrogated by Ohm are able to provide a satisfactory answer. So he endeavored to our players to send them north to look into the matter, and along the way, if they could, perhaps work with uh, the local duke to uh, establish better relations between the city now that the mayor was gone and Stockton. Perhaps do a job for the man should the duke have need for the adventuring party. They had been journeying for some time, but not really getting much ground covered due to constant interruptions. However, this session would prove quite the different. Um, After a brief encounter with a very bizarre lightning storm through which they witnessed a thunderbird stalking a mammoth across the plains, which nearly brought a rain of lightning upon them from the distance. The group actually managed to make extremely good time. How I do my long distance travel in D&D usually involves a random chart that I've meticulously put together, and whenever the players roll to see if something occurs, something usually occurs. Um, but if they roll on the chart and hit a number they've previously rolled, or a number window they've hit, because I don't write out 100 individual um, levels. Some things, events that are more common or have a better chance of occurring have a wider range, and events that are more unique have a smaller range. Um, and if they manage to hit the same number again, instead of having an encounter or an interaction or role play anything, instead of that happening, the players get to travel extra days uninterrupted. And for the first two legs of this journey, that really didn't happen ever. Which can happen because it's a big chart with a lot of options. Um, I did jump the gun a little bit there. We did take up immediately where we left off, with the group running into a trader from the city of Stockton who was bringing wares south. They endeavored to try and purchase some of their horses, but they were using their horses um, because those were their horses, and they didn't have spares. They had spares in so much that when their two main horses got tired, they could switch to alternates, and let the main horses rest without having to carry any immense weight. Um, and not wanting to buy anything else, the two groups went their own way, and that eventually led to the storm and a bit of interactions and roleplay between the party, um, an intimate moment between Zahn and Darnik. But beyond that, it was mostly travel for a good long while. They did come across a nice large sort of pond that's surrounded a little bit by valleys that seemed to be being fed from some sort of underground stream, and the pond was covered in a bit of scum, and the water was quite cold. Valinor, ever curious, decided to go and try and collect some sample of the pond scum just to see if there would be anything interesting in it later, and was attacked by a glacial toad and swallowed whole. At which point the party sort of rushed in to help as the wizard was almost dropped unconscious from the initial attack. And they are strong enough, and damage output in 5e is so spastic that they were able to deal with the creature in a single round before it even had a chance to activate again. At which point a second frog joined the fray and swallowed Darnik. Again, dealing a lot of damage, but not killing him by any stretch. And some of the members of the party ended up getting a little singed when Darnik used Dragon's Breath from within the frog, but the frog made it save. So sensing something was happening, the frog kind of like blew the flame out. It was pretty funny. Siren had taken the form of a bear, and it was a whole big old brawl. After he had been freed, Valinor, with like 2 hit points, had fallen back next to the healer, who was just constantly casting Toll the Dead and not healing anyone. Um, which was, funny as always. There were more toads in the water, but after the first 2 were dispatched within a round of attacking, the others just pulled the dead frogs in for a snack and let them go. And the party pulled back. Pushing onward, Rogue, Midnight, spotted a small cave with something twinkling in it, a little natural cubby sort of inside one of the hills, and decided not to do anything with it or investigate, and didn't tell anyone else, and no one else noticed. And so they pushed on, many more days passing, and it was then that the storm hit. This sudden, very powerful storm. Um, and lightning strikes. They attempted to take shelter, Valinor preparing to cast his tower spell, which takes about 10 minutes. And though he managed to maintain his concentration through some pretty near misses of lightning bolts, in the distance, some of the party could see a wall of lightning ripping its way across the plain. Like literally lightning raining from the sky like water. And it was getting pretty close pretty fast. Valinor continued to try and push on with his ritual, hoping to get the tower so they could get inside. Uh, and it was about that time where they figured, based off a rough estimation, they were not going to have the tower up in time. And it was then that the party spotted a thunderbird rip out of the clouds, fetch a mammoth off the ground, and pull it back up into the storm, and then begin flying away. Sort of dragging the lightning with it, which made the group a little nervous, but they managed to survive it fine enough. Pushing on, I believe they only experienced one more encounter before returning or reaching their destination, and the encounter was with Solomon. If people remember from the D&D recap, or the campaign catch-up video, Solomon is a dwarf. He's one of my favorite NPCs in my setting, and one I usually make interact with the players at some point, just because he's sort of ubiquitous with my setting. He really represents what the setting is all about, and the sort of thing that characters, players, and NPCs alike can achieve at their peak, basically. So this dwarf showed up, and the last time they saw him, he was riding a group of griffins, I want to say, north, and he was the one who actually rescued Zon from the woods when Zon had collapsed after fleeing the fearsome the wolves of the forest, and had collapsed, and Solomon had saved him and brought him to the party. This time, however, he was traveling with a much smaller group. He was riding on the back of a Cerberus, a 3-headed dog, with blue flames as a mane and eyes and mouth. They sort of just breathe it constantly. Very hot breath. And he was excited to see some people he knew on the road, and though Zahn was very concerned by the 3-headed dog, Darnick quickly put himself between the two, and Solomon did want to push on out of there quicker once he realized he was making Zahn uncomfortable with his puppy, um, because he didn't know that. He didn't particularly like making someone else uncomfortable. But people were asking him questions. They endeavored about buying mounts from him. But other than the Cerberus, Solomon really didn't have much on him. And they dug a little deeper and found out that he could rent them, in theory, after he sent a message. Uh, a pair of nightmares for 2 days for about 600 gold, just to get them the rest of their way uninterrupted. The nightmares, being capable of flight and extreme movement, could make them cover the 4 days worth of travel in 2 days without being interrupted. But the group were close enough that they figured that that was not something they'd want to do. They did ask about how much the Cerberus would be to buy, and uh, he did let them know that Emeth, his Cerberus, would cost a set amount of gold, and some of them were excited. Sad that they couldn't afford it right that second, but excited in general. But again, noticing that he was making Zahn uncomfortable, he excused himself. He did ask about the basilisk and informed them that he might swing by the city to visit the lizard. And seemed quite happy to know that it was with Grulock, who seems to be someone he trusts. The groups parted ways, and eventually they crested a rise and came upon the site of the city of Stockton. Within the shadow of a large mountain, at the bottom of which there is a thin forest and several fishing villages around large lakes that form at the base of the mountain. The city sort of forms a natural barrier blocking off the distance between that mountain and the shore, the coastline. Its walls, made of hard iron and steel, raise up, I think it was about 45 feet, and at a slight slant leading inward to make it difficult to be scaled by things that could climb. Um, they made their way to the gate and were met by a guard. Uh, and they spoke for a little while with the guard. He was merely making sure that everything was alright. A large party like this arriving from the south uh, could cause some issues. Or, just doing his job, basically. The group of travelers arrive at the city. However, the party does have papers proving that they're here for a reason. And though they're a very odd group, they're not anything that the people of Stockton would be leery of, except maybe Darnick. But tieflings are just rare, not inherently distrusted. Just seeing him would. Some people might not even know what he is, kind of deal. But the guards seemed to not mind, and again, once they provided the letters, he understood what was going on, and they sent the order along to let them in. They pulled open the portcullis to let them in. The group entered into a large corridor, which was about 10 feet wide, so just wide enough for a horse and wagon, um, and closed the gate behind them. They noticed immediately that this corridor is a bit of a kill zone. It's about 150 feet long, 10 feet wide, and on each side are walls that ramp up at an angle to large kill slits where archers could shoot from cover, spellcasters could cast from cover. There are rivets in the metal where oil might be poured down, like boiling pitch, who knows. Um, but it was very ominous, as the light from the sun has a very hard time getting into the tight corridor where the walls are so high. Um, and they were there for a good 10 minutes, waiting quietly for the gate at the other side to open, which it eventually did, and they walked out into the City of Justice. Stockton, though brisk and hard looking from the outside, um, is in many ways beautiful. It has large stone houses, most bearing two floors, with wood mixed in, heavy stone, cobbled streets, and this sort of bizarre uniformity. Unlike the city, where buildings come in many different shapes and sizes and their placement is a little more haphazard, as they opened into King Square, this large open area within the gate, full of markets and vendors, they noticed, especially Midnight, picking up with his keen eye, just how uniform the city was. Each row of buildings and houses was very meticulously placed to create blocks and grids. Even the buildings that have an irregular shape, like a smithy or a tavern or a longhouse, possibly a hall of some sort, um, was sort of meticulously placed for reasons. And around them, there was a large group of people moving about, dealing with traders, buying, selling, just chatting. And what really caught their attention was in the middle of the square, there was a figure dancing. An elf with very long hair pushed off to one side, the other side sort of short and curly, wearing very little except for several layers of extremely thin clothing, a sort of shawl that runs down across their neck and along their arms, and very thin layers of pants that are again tripled up of just many different colors, sort of giving this figure with relatively tan skin this sort of rainbow look. And this dancer was sort of performing in the middle of the street with a few musicians nearby, playing drums and harps and just sort of creating music. Um, and they were all sort of enraptured by it, and so was a lot of the crowd. But a few of the party weren't fully taken with it and were still aware that they had something they needed to do. Um, So, after a little bit of being distracted, they pulled on. Siren, the only member of the group who'd been to this city before, knew the way to Queen Square directly would be just through an alley which runs through the center of the city. Because, again, the city's roads sort of branch out, but in between those roads are a very specifically designed alleyways, as none of the houses sort of touch. And as they were going through the alleys, they noticed that a lot of the homes, though they all have this sort of rigid uniformity to them, have a lot of beauty. Stained glass windows of many colors, warm fires glowing from the inside, and many of them possess small gardens and yards that have gates that open into the alleys. And as they were walking by, they noticed some children playing while their parents cooked at an external fire, and they sort of waved and were just a spectacle because of how odd they looked. And it has this very tight feel, and it's a little claustrophobic, but there is beauty and nature there, even in this city. Um, they saw a few homeless as well, a few people who looked more down on their luck, a few children running around. A group of children at one point did run through the group. And Siren, I believe, noticed that one of the children seemed to be moving a little weird. Um, More graceful than the other children. Harder to see. Like they could just sort of blend in with the shadows. Um, and they sort of cut through the group at one point, and everyone had to stop and then keep moving. Um, at which point they entered into Queen Square, the religious district, which at the center has a large fountain upon which there are three statues, uh, Jamal, Jericho, and Meridia. The three, it'd be incorrect to call them patron gods of the Duralian Empire, as the Duralian Empire does worship the entire Duralian pantheon. But they are the three gods who get the most airtime. They have the most followers and dedicated sort of churches to their particular rule. The three of them form the basis for this statue. And on the other side of this large fountain, where a lot of couples and lovey-dovey people sort of sit and enjoy their lunch and breaks from work, and monks and pilgrims make their way talking, and clerics are there and paladins having conversations. They could see the courthouse of Jamal. It was a building they could see from before when they were outside of the city. From the external of the city, they could see this massive courthouse with its large stained glass window of a black scale on a shattered rainbow backdrop. They could also see the fortress, the keep, off to the west, which would be where the Duke lives, they'd imagine. But this courthouse, again, is this massive building of stone, much larger than all the others, probably large enough to rival the keep where the Duke lives. Um, and it has this brilliant stained glass window um, that is just absolutely huge. Um, they talked a little bit on the outside, trying to discuss who should do the talking and who should do what on the inside. A lot of the role play of this particular session was more along the lines of who should have to speak. And it usually came down to being everyone just going, we should just make Levy do it, or Darnick. Um, Darnick makes a bit of sense being a charisma-based caster, but Levy just is very personable. Whereas Darnick can occasionally go a little nonverbal. Um, Eventually, though, the group pushed in as this conversation went on for some time. And they opened the large doors into a small foyer, which has rows of well-made, sort of dark burgundy leather waiting chairs and a small clerk's desk, at which they saw a human, probably in his early 30s, late 20s, short hair, frazzled look. It looked like his hair had been properly groomed that morning, but had quickly, like, sort of been frazzled and undone. Um, just from work, and he had large bags under his eyes and just stacks upon stacks of papers, reams of paper. Um, so much so that he didn't even notice when Kovalin decided to summon their eidolon Basiri into the room. As he was just focused on his work, he hadn't even fully noticed them. Um, at which point, Darnick and Levy made their presence a bit more clear, and he snapped his way out of it. And Levy introduced herself, and he introduced himself as Jared. And they spoke for a little while. They showed their paperwork, explaining that they were here to see Jamal. Um, and Jared was like, yes, of course, we could absolutely help you with this, but I understand that there's a bit of a wait. How does next month sound? And basically doing, his job. He can't just rush people in. Uh, and Levy was being more adamant and a little pushy that they needed to see him as, like, now or as soon as possible. And Jared very clearly explained that he could make them the priority, of course, with this paperwork. Um, that if there is a cancellation in a scheduled meeting, he can immediately get them in. He was going to suggest a place they could stay in the city if they needed one nearby where he could easily find them, or someone from the church could. And during all this, Levy's still trying to be a little pushy, but that's when Valinor walks up and just offers to bribe him, which really was the wrong thing to do, as it made Jared quite upset, and he very quickly became defensive and sort of flushed in the face, um, and started sort of defending his position, and getting a little abrasive, more than you'd normally expect customer service. It was then that a voice rang out, and he went quiet. As the group turned to witness, the image gets a little stretch, I'm sorry. But a woman in plate mail with a maul, sort of undercut on one side of her head, the other, this sort of long, curly hair. Um, who they would learn is the woman named Patricia Holston. Patricia appeared to be a prelate, or a chancellor, a high ranking member of the church. And having heard the noise and Jared began raising his voice and get very angry and upset, had come to sort of calm everything down. She excused Jared and informed him to go take a break or rest in one of the side rooms, and that she would deal with some of his paperwork in the meantime, to sort of give him a few minutes to catch his breath. Um, Jared did let her know that one of them was trying to bribe him, though, and that's not really something she would condone either, but she's very level headed. She spoke with the party in a very calm tone, gathered why they were there. She informed them that Father Isaacs had sealed up the courthouse at the moment and that no one was to go inside without his explicit permission. The actual courtroom. However, Levy and Darnick and the others really sort of pushed their case, trying to explain that, like, it's their job. They're not trying to be pushy. It's just, we're here for this one thing. If we could, we would really like to just do this one thing so we could leave. Um, and Patricia, not wanting to be too forceful, decided to give them a chance. And she took them to the main door to the courthouse, which had a pair of heavily armored paladins, clearly in magical gear, black armor with white scales instead of the usual sort of gray with black. Um, Patricia spoke to them for a moment, and they pulled the heavy chains off of the courthouse door and opened it just wide enough for her to slip in before closing it behind. Covalent at this point just sort of began rambling at the guards about their armor. One responded at first, sort of caught off guard by the sudden questions and inquiries of the little gnome, and the other one quickly reminded him they were on duty with a bit of an elbow jab, and they clammed up. A few minutes passed, and Patricia returned, looking pretty sad and just down emotionally. But she let them know that Father Isaac says that he would meet with one of them. Um, and while the group sort of tried to decide who that should be, uh, several of them noticed that it was pretty clear that Patricia was only going to let Levy in. And that sort of answered the question for them. Because Levy had been the one who had spoken to her at the start. So Levy was allowed into the main courtroom, this massive auditorium with rows of pews that you would see in a church, as well as high stands on either side for jury and staffers, a defendant and accuser tables at the front of the courthouse beyond a wall, a small wooden barrier, and beyond that a very large throne, most likely where Jamal would sit. And the room was empty and very bereft of light, save for the natural light coming in through the massive stained glass window, which was painting that image of the scales and the rainbow lights up and behind the throne. And in the room was an old man, sort of knelt in prayer. Levy quietly moved up to him, not really wanting to interrupt his prayers, but Patricia had made it very clear that Levy would not have very much time in the room. So she went up and met Father Isaacs. Sadly, another image that got a little distorted. My bad. Father Isaacs was an old man, probably in his late 70s, early 80s, in plate mail. His sword was with him as he was praying, but it was in its scabbard. And as Levy approached, he sort of, looked at her, pulled himself up into his seat, and spoke to her. And the two exchanged a very brief greeting, and she explained that there was some stuff that she wanted to say, and he asked her to sit down beside him in the pew. So Levy sort of scooted past him, all Christian-like, and sat down, and that was where we ended the session, as it was at the end of our session. So it should be very exciting to see how the conversation with Father Isaacs goes, and what the group might learn next, and what the Duke might have in store for them. It's all very exciting, and I'm very, very interested to see what they're going to do in the city, as several of them have showed interest in trying to hunt down that dancer. If you have any questions, comments, inquiries about specifics of this campaign, this session, this setting, or anything else, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll try and help out as best as I can. And if you're interested in just seeing more of it, check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Silaninil. Silaninil. There you'll find homebrew for original subclasses, items, and monsters from the setting, as well as full classes such as the Summoner and the Gunslinger that I've made in my spare time. The Summoner book includes not just a full new caster class, 7 subclasses, but over 160 new monsters, which are all in my setting and involve lore tidbits for each monster. But you'll also find original fiction and a lot of the art I commission, or my players have had commissioned, for their characters or NPCs over time. Uh, all of that becomes available for just $1 a month, and every little bit helps. So if you think you could spare $1 a month, I'd greatly appreciate it. And it would give you a lot more content, as I just recently uploaded a full novella set in my D&D setting, the God's Home setting, as I've always called it. Thank you for coming by, and I hope you have yourself a fantastic week.